the 2020 Washington Conference on the Americas. My name is Eric Farnsworth, the Vice President and Head of the Washington office of the Council of the Americas, and I'm very pleased once again to be able to welcome you, this time, and for the first time ever, virtually. Like everything else, our conference has been disrupted by COVID-19. How ironic that our theme last year was about regional disruptors, and we are now living through perhaps the single greatest disruptor we have faced in our lifetimes. And so our theme this year is, after the pandemic, restoring hope and growth in the Americas. We hope our conference will be a harbinger this year of regional recovery, and we'll be exploring these themes between now and the end of this calendar year. We are very pleased to be able to launch our conference plenary sessions today with the U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and to continue them on Wednesday, July 1st, with the President of the World Bank, David Malpass. It's no exaggeration to say that we rely on you, our members, to make this conference possible. This year, once again, despite dramatically changed circumstances, we have an A-plus list of sponsors, including our presenting platinum sponsors, including Chevron, General Motors, and Merck Inventing. And our gold sponsors, Chiquita Brands, Freeport-McMoRan, Integra Capital, MetLife, Principal Financial Group, Repsol, and Sempra Energy. And again, this year, our media partner is the Financial Times. Each one of these sponsors has stood with us during particularly difficult times, and we are terrifically grateful for their support. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me now in welcoming the President and CEO of the Council of the Americas, Susan Siegel. Susan.
Well, thank you, Eric, and welcome to all of you. I want to thank Eric and his team for their hard work, their perseverance to really put this program together, the first ever virtual Washington conference amid the most unusual and difficult circumstances that we have faced as a hemisphere and as a world in the 50 years since this conference was first held. Since mid-March, we have done over 100 public policy programs with over 10,000 attendees. In terms of topics, we've covered an even broader range than before: the effects of the pandemic on healthcare systems in the region, the role of institutional investors in economic recovery, digital economy issues, implementation of the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, and a host of other topics: ministers, women's hemispheric networks, CEO roundtables. Every day, something different and something unique. As we have convened the Washington Conference over the last 50 years, we have successfully promoted and enabled active collaborative engagement that has driven the type of advances we want to see. So we are determined to be a convener, both virtually and in person, over the next 50 years, with the goal of driving further change, to making a policy impact, and to make what we all hope is for a reality for all people of the Americas. Again, I want to thank each and every one of you for your support of the Council. I want to thank you for your support of the Washington Conference as we seek to fulfill our mission. I'd now like to turn the microphone over to our chairman, Andres Gluski, to introduce our first speaker. Andres?
Thank you, Susan and Eric, for getting us started today. And good afternoon to everyone. As we kick off this first virtual Washington Conference on the Americas, it is my honor today to introduce our first speaker. We really couldn't do better than to have the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, begin our conference. As you all know, the State Department has always hosted our conference. And that not being an option this year, having the Secretary of State open it for us provides us a wonderful thread of continuity that will sustain the connection until we can gather once again in the Benjamin Franklin Reception Room and the Lloyd Henderson Conference Hall. I think it speaks volumes that he has taken the time today to join us to talk about U.S. policy in the Western Hemisphere. Even though it is our hemisphere, even though we have a new trade agreement with our North American partners coming into effect this week, even though the cultural and business ties, the so-called people-to-people connections between the United States and every country in the region have never been stronger. Even so, the Americas often does not appear to be a top priority in Washington. That is why the Washington Conference on the Americas is so important, and why your presence with us as we focus on our relations with our neighbors is so meaningful, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for your time today, and we look forward to your remarks.
Andres, thank you. And yes, in fact, they have been 2 challenging years for sure. Thank you for that warm welcome. Congratulations on celebrating your 50th anniversary of this august conference. Seems like a long time ago now that I visited Colombia, Costa Rica, and Jamaica. It was my first trip of this calendar year back in January. The trip for me reinforced something I think you all know, that the countries of the Western Hemisphere have no better friend than the United States of America. We share geography, we share borders, a commitment to democracy, massive ties of tourism and trade. Asphalt from Trinidad and Tobago was even used to pave Pennsylvania Avenue right here in Washington. There are always ups and downs in our relationship, always have been, likely always will be. But overall, Canadians in Vancouver and Chileans in Santiago both know that the United States endures as a real friend. That kind of stability and steadiness is critical in these uncertain times. You all are facing the brunt of COVID-19 pandemic even as we speak. We too have seen cases rise in recent weeks from Nevada to California and Florida. It can be hard when you're in the middle of a crisis to see beyond it, but we must lay the groundwork now for the post-COVID-19 economic renewal, a renewal that's consistent with the principles of freedom and our friendship. That's why I want to discuss briefly today before I take a handful of questions. First things first, the Trump administration is focused on the economic trajectory of the Western Hemisphere. Indeed, we've laid a predicate for it in our good work, unprecedented among presidential administrations to sustain a hemisphere of freedom. This condition is critical to our mutual success. Without freedom, there is no economic prosperity, no sustainable social progress, and no better future for our peoples. It's a remarkable achievement that today, only the people of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela are saddled with authoritarian regimes in this hemisphere. And we're working to change those outliers. We've worked through the OAS to help the Venezuelan people to ensure free and fair elections in Bolivia and to investigate Ortega's regime abuses in Nicaragua. The Lima Group is comprised of another set of nations that have put their shoulder to the wheel for democracy in Venezuela. We've rolled back the Obama administration's coziness with Cuba. We've allowed Americans to litigate the Cuban government to reclaim property that had been expropriated during the Castro regime's reign of terror. Elsewhere in the region, we've convened foreign ministers from the region twice for the sole purpose of strategizing how to crack down on terrorists like Hezbollah and their financiers that live throughout the region. And we're happy to see both Paraguay and Argentina designate Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. We've also upheld the rule of law, the core of democracy, by working with Mexico and countries throughout Central America to control illegal immigration flows and address a broken asylum-seeking system here in America. Just this year, the United States and Bolivia agreed to exchange ambassadors for the first time in more than a decade. Our mission going forward will be to support the trajectory of freedom the countries in our region have embraced. All of this work is a critical basis for confronting a challenge that is soon to come. You don't have to be Nostradamus to see that the Chinese Communist Party will try to take advantage of this economic downturn, one of its own doing, to grow its corrosive footprint in the region. Every country is free to make its own choices about who they do business with. I'm America's Secretary of State. I admit I want American companies, or frankly, any companies that do business fairly and transparency, to get the contracts to build roads, to build 5G networks, and energy infrastructure. But I want our friends in the hemisphere to prosper too. I talk about China's disturbing business practices because everyone should know the facts. Caveat investor. ZTE has run surveillance pilot programs in Venezuela, enabling the illegitimate Maduro regime to deny food and medical aid to desperate citizens because it doesn't like their political allegiance. Ecuador, under a previous administration, took on enormous debt to China for a faulty dam. Last year, the China Communications Construction Company began bulldozing indigenous people's homes as part of the São Luís megaport project in Brazil. Costa Ricans are furious about endless delays and cost overruns for a simple highway project, which they may never have delivered to them. They also had to take a Chinese state-owned enterprise to international arbitration to cancel a refinery project mired in corruption in their country. There are major concerns about countries adopting Chinese biometric tools, leaving the CCP able to tap into South and Central American health networks as well. How dangerous for peoples that care so much about privacy. We don't want the CCP's dollars to undo the good work the region has made towards transforming itself into a hemisphere of freedom. We have control of the future. We can work together to grow our way out of this mess, and I am confident that we will. It's true. The United States government doesn't offer giant state subsidies like the Chinese communists do for their companies. It's just not the American way. The Trump administration seeks to unleash the power of private sector to create favorable environments that American companies and investors need before they invest in a new project. This is consistent with the policies that we put into place. Our Retooled Development Finance Corporation is dedicated to providing technical assistance for countries, political risk insurance for companies, equity financing, and other goods. We have plenty of projects in the pipeline for Latin America. Earlier this month, we approved more than $600 million in loans and grants for projects in Colombia, Ecuador, Guatemala, and Mexico, many of them benefiting women entrepreneurs, by the way. Our Growth in Americas program, launched back in 2018, is catalyzing private sector investment in energy and infrastructure, and we're sharing best practices and technical assistance as well. To date, we've signed Growth in America MOUs with Panama, Chile, Jamaica, Argentina, Colombia, El Salvador, Ecuador, and Brazil. Finally, and Andres briefly referenced this, the USMCA. The region's economic ties have been solidified. Our trade terms are now clear. When the dust settles from the pandemic, our companies will have new clarity on the business environment. We're proud of the work we've done. But the real answer to economic growth that's consistent with freedom is for countries to take their own steps, to open up, to reform, and to liberate their economies. You don't need us to do that. Let's encourage our friends in the hemisphere to take bold steps on their own. If we're successful in that mission, it will help sustain momentum for taking our relationship in the region to new heights. I talked about this phenomenon in a speech in Chile last year. It's happening already in Ecuador and in Brazil and in Bolivia. Look at Brazil, now a major non-NATO ally. The president obtained new market access for American farmers in Brazil, opening up beef, lobster, wheat, and ethanol exports. We have relaunched our bilateral CEO forum, and we're discussing a trade package for later this year. These good things can happen from Ottawa to Kingston to Montevideo. Look, I ran a couple of small companies for more than a decade. I wouldn't expect business to do anything that isn't good for their own bottom line. That's just business. But as I told Silicon Valley executives back in January, protecting freedom isn't just the government's job. I hope you all will continue to be some of America's best ambassadors for freedom in Latin America and around the world. Thank you, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for those words and that clear vision for everything America is doing for the Americans. We have a number of questions here. I'd like to ask Susan Greenwell, who's the Senior Vice President of MetLife, who has a question for you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Andres. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you, Secretary Pompeo, for your remarks. Just to provide some context, I'm going to ask a Mexico-related question. MetLife is the largest insurance company in Mexico, providing life, health, and retirement protection to about 12 million Mexicans. So we understand, we learned last week that President Lopez Obrador plans to visit Washington to participate in the USMCA kickoff ceremony. And of course, this is his first official trip to a foreign country. We at MetLife certainly stand ready to continue actively participating on the implementation and further development of the trade agreement, which we know will be a significant pillar in the process of social and economic growth of the US, Mexico, and Canada. So we're interested if you could share any specific insights or plans on the visit of President Lopez Obrador, some of the main objectives of the visit, and if anything specific to the implementation process might be addressed while he's in the US.
Susan, thanks for the question. I can't say a whole lot, as we'll make some announcements in the coming days about the scope and what we hope to achieve, but I think common sense can tell us all. First of all, it is his first trip outside of Mexico. We're happy to have it be to Washington, D.C. We think that's a great place for him to come on his first trip, and we're happy that it's going to come here this summer. Second, it's a great day to launch what has been a long and arduous process on the USMCA, and we're glad that he's going to come do this on American soil. We think that's important. There are a handful of things, I think, related to implementation that we'll try to get done while he's here. But I'm also reminded that there are other issues that we'll want to address with the Mexican government as well. There are real opportunities in the energy space. There are real opportunities in the technology space and in the manufacturing space, in addition to financial services that you spoke about earlier. So we think there are real opportunities for him to hear and see and get a taste of what the United States can do that will build on and be consistent with what's laid out in the USMCA. And then we obviously have a set of global issues, that is non-bilateral issues, places where we hope that the Mexican government will work alongside of us. The challenge in Venezuela is one where we need the Mexican government to step up and do more to create a set of democratic institutions inside of Venezuela. So there's a host of regional issues that we hope to have some time to spend with President Lopez Obrador as well. And I think his time here on the ground will permit him to do all of those things.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We have a second question from Roberto Walker, who's president for Latin America of the Principal Financial Group.
Andres, Roberto's having some audio problems, so he's asked if you could ask the question on his behalf, please.
Could you go ahead and do it, Eric? I don't have it in front of me.
The question has to do with pension systems, Mr. Secretary, across the region, which have become targets for revenue raising by governments who need to find revenue wherever they can, and just the sense of if you and your folks in the department are working with Latin and regional governments to make sure that investor rights are protected during this very difficult time.
The answer is yes. This is not unique to this hemisphere. This is a challenge all across the world. It's not related just to pension systems. There are many nations and many leaders that have chosen to use this challenging time as a result of the virus to take actions that they wouldn't otherwise have taken. Some of them feel like they need to do it out of necessity. This is to your point. They need to raise revenue. Their economies are shambles. We are trying to make sure when it comes to all financial instruments, whether that's pension systems, debt holdings, all of the places where you could have governments make decisions that were inconsistent with the property rights, contractual rights that were laid out for them, that they'll continue to honor those. But we face that among many fronts, not just the financial front as well, where we see governments engaging in opportunistic behavior, both to raise revenue and, frankly, sadly, to reduce human rights around the world as well. The team is fully engaged. It's something that we anticipated when we saw the scale of the global economic downturn that was going to take place. We're deeply aware that we are also at the front end of this. These economic challenges in some countries are going to extend for many, many, many months. So we anticipate that the pressure to engage in the kinds of activities that were hypothesized in the question is not only upon us today, but we'll continue to need to remain vigilant to protect the interests and rights of Americans who have either invested in or have obligations outstanding in each of those countries that's tried to take advantage of this moment to solve a problem for themselves.
General Motors?
Andres, could you repeat that? I think you were muted half the time.
Oh, sorry. Yes, Mr. Secretary, we have a third question from Tom Cooney, who's Vice President of General Motors.
Hello, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes, Tom, I got you.
Okay, great. Good afternoon. Thank you for your time this afternoon with us. My question is related back to COVID-19. As you know, the pandemic came to Latin America a little bit later than the rest of the world, but now it's hitting pretty hard. Countries like Brazil, infection rates are very high. Mexico still hasn't hit its peak. So my question to you, sir, is what changes might be contemplated, if any, in existing U.S. economic and trade policy goals to help Latin America overcome the worst of the economic shock and to strengthen regional trade? Thank you.
So I think your predicate is correct. I think there are many nations in the Western Hemisphere where the worst of the challenge from COVID is still in front of them. And then I think you're only at the tip of the iceberg with respect to the economic challenges as well. I don't know beyond that. I don't know that there'll be any significant trade changes that are made. I couldn't tell you. Maybe USTR is thinking about something that I'm not aware of. I suppose it's possible. But we have all begun to take a hard look. And when I say we, Western lending nations, the IMF, the World Bank, the IDB, everybody who has an economic stake in the success in these places, taking a look at what are the tools that we have, whether that is how to think about debt and debt repayments, how to think about future investments. We run an operation at the State Department where we are deeply engaged, trying to figure out how to make sure that we get any U.S. taxpayer dollars that we provide in terms of financial support to these countries to the right place in a timely fashion, something that U.S. government's not often very nimble at, to make sure that we actually meet the need at the time it's there. There will be significant economic challenges in a handful of these countries for a long time. So we have begun collectively inside of the USG, and then I know I've talked with both the leaders of the IMF and World Bank about how we might together, along with some of the other large financial nations, G20 and others, figure out a way to make sure that these countries have the capacity to make it through this, the trough, the most difficult points in their own economic trajectory.
I understand you have to leave at 3:20?
I think that's right. So one more, if you have it, I'm happy to take.
I would say that if you look 5 years from now, you know, how would you characterize how you would see what changes in the U.S. Latin American relations would you like to see?
Well, you know, I spoke about this in my opening remarks. It's been remarkable to watch this hemisphere. I know the history, maybe not as well as some of the others on this call, but I know the history of this region. It hasn't always been filled with democracies that were prepared to engage in a robust economic and economic exchange undergirded by freedom. We're now in such a much better place. I hope that trajectory continues. That is, I identified the three big challenges that we have: Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. But even in those countries today that have democratic institutions, I hope that 5 years from now, those economic institutions or those democratic institutions are even stronger, more robust, less challenged, less susceptible to an economic downturn where some leader decides to go back to the bad old days of authoritarianism and nation-centered economies. So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that the United States will do its part to make sure that this trajectory towards freedom continues in the region. I'm optimistic that it will be, that it'll take everyone's attention, not only the United States government's attention, but attention from American businesses and private sector businesses around the region to invest in the right way, to demand the rule of law and property rights. And if we do that, if we help with those things and help these governments be successful, these nations be successful at taking care of their own people, then I'm confident that what that be 2025, we'll see this hemisphere of freedom even stronger.
Well said, Mr. Secretary, and the Council of Americas will do its part.
Great. Thank you, Andres. I appreciate that. So long.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Eric, would you like to have the closing remarks?
Absolutely. There's nothing more to say. It's hard to follow you, Andres, and the Secretary of State and Susan Siegel, but simply to thank everybody for joining us for the opening plenary session. We hope all of you will return on Wednesday when we'll be hosting the President of the World Bank, David Malpass, from 1 to 2 p.m. Washington time. And with that, we are concluding this session. Thank you again to our sponsors. Thank you to all of you for joining us. And we hope to see you again Wednesday and frequently in the future. Thank you very much.